Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we celebrate creativity. We are obsessed with story, and we seek out amazing and interesting people to find out what makes them tick. I'm Sean Murphy, your host. I'm a writer. I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts, and I direct the Story Center at Shenandoah University. For more about me, you can check that out at seanmurphy.net. But the thing I love most about these different roles is it has afforded me the opportunity to be in regular contact with amazing and interesting people, many of whom I cajole into talking to me so I can learn and be inspired. And I hope you can too. If you know me at all, you already know these two people because I never go more than 6 to 8 months without involving them in some way in my shenanigans. So it is my extraordinary pleasure and honor, as always, to welcome back Karen E. Bender and Robert Anthony Siegel. Let me introduce them. And I always feel obliged to say, like, I truncate the bios of some of my guests because otherwise it would fill up the whole time just reading their accomplishments. So check them out online. We'll provide links, but here's the brief versions. Karen E. Bender is the author of the short story collection Refund, which was a finalist for the 2015 National Book Award in fiction and also a Los Angeles Times bestseller. Her collection, The New Order, was on the long list for the Story Prize. She's also the author of novels Like Normal People and A Town of Empty Rooms. Her third collection of stories, The Words of Dr. L, will be published by Counterpoint Press in May of 2025. We're going to talk about that. And her fiction has appeared in all the best magazines. Trust me. She's taught creative writing in the classroom, led online workshops. She's edited magazines. She is the real deal. I'm always overjoyed to have her in my presence, as well as her husband and partner in crime, Robert Anthony Siegel, who is a writer, writing coach, and author of the amazing memoir Criminals, as well as 2 novels, All Will Be Revealed and All the Money in the World. His work has appeared in, among many others, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Smithsonian Magazine, Paris Review, Plowshares, and other places. It's been anthologized in Best American Essays. He's been a Fulbright Scholar in Taiwan, a Paul Engel Fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he's taught creative writing at the college level for decades. Like I said, anyone that knows me already knows you guys, but for those that are getting their first taste, welcome Karen and Robert, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you.
We're delighted to be here.
Well, it's, and one of my favorite stories about John Coltrane is he was described by his drummer as he was so amped up that he would work up a sweat in the dressing room before he came on stage. And I feel like our time in the green room before we came on epitomizes our relationship. We had to catch up before we could go live. So fortunately, when we get together, there's seldom a shortage of topics, but I would be remiss, I think, to not start by saying, Karen, you got a little bit of news going on. Tell us about what's happening this spring.
Well, thank you, Sean. So this is a galley for my third collection. It's called The Words of Dr. L and Other Stories. It is a collection. It's a mix of speculative and realistic stories about parents and children separating at different points or stages of life. So, so I'm excited to share. Yay, it's coming out in May from Counterpoint.
So we'll get into a little bit about what that entails, because all of us have been through more than once. There really are, right, the various stages. There's like the writing, which is everything, but it's like, okay, so the easy part's over. You wrote a book that got published. Now you got to get ready for the promotion and the post and the read. So we'll get into all that. But Robert, what's going on with you? And what do you have coming down the pipeline other than just being awesome and being yourself?
Oh, that's the part I focus on.
Good job.
I'm writing short fiction and essays. I have a a short story coming out in a literary magazine called 5 Points in soon, I think in December or January. And and I'm working on another story. I keep these right now. What I say is I ask myself, what story would be impossible to write?
Mm.
And then I try to write it.
It isn't that
Takes
that's
a
kind of
long
like
time.
that's like the adage, right? I think Toni Morrison, write the book that needs to be written. Like write the book that hasn't been written yet. It's like it always seems to come down to elemental, like not a big mystery, but I know you well enough to not be surprised. Like, well, how can I create an obstacle that I then have to find my way out of? I can relate to that a little bit, but there is something about kind of raising the bar and putting yourself in an uncomfortable situation that only you can get yourself out of.
I often regret it.
But it's all about the journey, right?
Yeah, no, it's that I wanted that level of engagement for myself, that feeling of
Mm.
of total immersion. That's when I thought about it, that's what I really like from writing. That's what I wanted.
Mm.
And I just had to, and so that I am inside the story and only thinking about the story. That's especially with everything going on in the world.
Right.
That that seemed, I just wanted to enter that cave
Mm.
and find the buried treasure.
Mm.
And that could be just buried treasure for me. I mean, like a little shiny bauble, but that's the shiny bauble that I wanted.
But so I think that's noteworthy though, and I think it's worth lingering a moment on that whole sensibility and approach to craft, because when I read about writing, or I'll just say when I have read about writing, broadly speaking, it's usually targeting an audience or a particular theme or format or genre. And what you both are talking about, right, is writing for ultimately oneself and the readers that one imagines hopefully will connect. And it's this active engagement or anticipated dialogue. And I think that really is separate in a not snobby way from people whose primary concern is, why would I bother to write if it's not going to be a bestseller? Like we're talking about really appreciating the craft on like a cellular level. So I just want to celebrate that and acknowledge it, because that, talking to career writers and teachers who still find that challenge and still find it fresh and a little bit mysterious, I think speaks volumes.
Mm.
Hmm. Well, you said it better
Yeah.
than I could possibly say.
No, that's
Um,
totally, yeah.
So my it's also my time of life, I think. My mother is 90 years old and I spend a lot of time helping her out. Um, and it's a very inward looking world. She and I talk about the little stuff. We'll go down, there's a garden behind her building in Manhattan. We'll sit there and she'll close her eyes and she'll say, "What's that sound?" And I'll say, "Mom, it's a sprinkler. They're watering the flowers." And she was like, "Oh yes, of course. I hear it now." And
Mm.
and that's sort of the level. It's like that's sort of the level we're at.
Mhm.
It's really paying attention.
Yes.
It's like
yes.
a deep
And the
attention.
world is
Yeah.
a kind of microcosm.
Mhm.
Well, and you both are
Contain the universe at the same
sure.
time.
And you both are back in your happy place, right? I know you've both, for work and life has taken you, and it's for periods of time you were both doing like commutes and stuff, but you're both back in the Big Apple. I know that suits you on a lot of levels.
Oh, yeah. Happy to be.
Yes.
Yeah, we're very happy to be back in New York, and we live in Brooklyn, and we're teaching various places, and it's just wonderful. It's perfect. Yeah.
I actually like the subway, which
Oh.
if you've been on the New York subway is just outrageous. Admitting that is like, I don't know what it says, but
It says you're an authentic New Yorker. There's no question about it.
I don't know what it is, but it's, it's my temple of Dendur.
Yeah.
It
Makes total sense. Like that moment when you kind of see that little light coming right around the bend, right before the
it's the cat.
oops.
Cats, Pez is a very pet friendly podcast. So
He's got to go.
Yeah. All right. Uh, so yeah, like you see that light coming through the tunnel, and then it's like there's a subway. It's like God coming. It's just great.
yeah, actually, I'm hearing you say that and looking at my shirt and saying the green light from Gatsby. So there are larger forces operating right now. Let's just go with it. Um, Robert, you picking up the kitty cat actually is an ideal segue. I just wanted for people that don't know you two, I'm just going to frame it thusly, and I beg your indulgence because I don't want to call. It's not necessary to call attention to this, but I want to celebrate the fact it's not insignificant to me that I'm talking to happily married creatives um, who also teach, are parents of amazing and talented children, um, and also active literary citizens. So that I mean, that's just a high five moment. But the reason I want to acknowledge it is because I think what you two do for me anyway is provide a very welcome counterpoint to writers hate cliches, right? Genuinely hate cliches. But we hear so often about the miserable writers who leave ruined relationships in their wake. I just get such a kick out of knowing and considering friends, two individuals who I would admire their writing and them as people. But I just want to celebrate the fact that you're a happily married, amazingly successful and talented creative couple.
Thank you, Sean.
You're helping blast away, right? Because we're in this art monsters moment, right? Which I think we need to be in. We need to be at least taking a critical eye on our heroes, who we elevate, why we elevate them. Does it matter separating the art from the artist? I've been guilty of saying, as just in my own personal opinion, it never hurts. The work always has to account for itself. It just has to. But when you know a creative that happens to be a very special person, it does add, I guess it's the opposite, duh. It's the opposite of when you love a movie and you find out that the director was a scumbag. Like, does that mean you can't watch the movie again? No, I don't think so, but it might detract. Knowing the people that do good work are good people, there's something just very inspiring about that.
Well, but aren't you another example?
Yeah, right. That's true.
Yeah, I mean, but you guys are a married couple that both write really well and have built this solidarity. You are literary citizens I want to elevate as role models for, I think, a moment in time where we are desperately in need of seeing how these things can work. What's the Aristotelian ideal of a happily married creative couple? And it's like, we've got one.
So I really think in a way, it's a specific example of a general problem, which is that when two people work in the same industry, and are making a living in the same way, there's a particular vulnerability to that. You know, a downturn in the industry,
Yeah.
and we're both vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? And in academia, where we made a living for, it was over 20 years, there's something called the two-body problem.
Yeah.
So a university hires a professor, but the spouse is usually also a professor who has not been hired, right? And unless there's a two-job deal, which even by our time was becoming less and less
Yeah.
common, and is now, from what I hear, rare. So we had this kind of vulnerability.
Mm. Yeah.
But it's an economic vulnerability, and money, there's always an answer of some kind,
Yeah.
often illegal.
Well, I would say one thing that helps, well, I think actually helps relationships and also helps a writer's life is a low overhead. I mean, and that actually is something that we've had our whole life, right?
So your
We-
spouse should be a cheap date.
Yeah, I think that actually is, that's a good, actually, because we actually had our apartments had
We had a cheap
we
apartment
had cheap apartments.
in Tribeca, which is now the most luxe part of Manhattan. We
Yeah,
just walked into it.
yeah,
The neighborhood was changing around us.
yeah.
Previously it was us and a lot of abandoned buildings
And
and
rats.
rats.
That were dancing on the sidewalk.
Right.
So, yeah, so I think that was helpful because we both were working. We didn't have to be on a horrible treadmill of work where we couldn't write, right? It was hard enough, to have that. And then, you know, and then, we had, Robert had a full-time job. I was teaching part-time with the two little kids. That was hard, it was hard juggling. It's a lot about time, and then I had a job commuting to Roanoke from Wilmington, and that was 5 hours, and so, so but I think the more you can get in a situation where you have a lower overhead, and that's harder in cities, but I think not impossible.
Right.
I think the more you simplify, the better, because basically one of your top priorities is your work, your writing, like you do share, and that's important.
Incidentally, when we were in Tribeca, I was actually working in publishing. So I've experienced two fragile industries
Right.
that are
Yeah.
going through a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, some sort of cataclysmic devolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, extinction level events unfolding before our eyes.
Yes, in fact, the publishing house I worked for went bankrupt, and that sort of initiated the move into academia.
Well, so I mean, let's lean right into that, because I mean, I tend to ask everybody I speak to that plays in this world in some capacity. Like, I'll just tee it up by saying we've already kind of gone right up to the edge, but I am the sort that is very interested in academia, the arts, the world of creatives. And the majority of the news is not positive right now. And specifically thinking about whatever happens in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, like the vistas for the artistic soul, especially the younger one, are even more tenuous than they were when we were coming up, and they felt pretty tenuous then. Any kind of reactions on where we are, what you're seeing, and we can kind of riff on, leaning into, it's definitely not a boom economy for writers, but where are we seeing bright spots, and what do we need to be aware of?
Wait, there's a bright spot?
I told you I wasn't going to be super negative on the.
If I could just preface, in my own view, for what it's worth, and I don't know if it's worth anything at all, there's never a bad time to write. Writing is a deeply enriching, nurturing, energizing, fulfilling practice. It was that way if you were living in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. People risked their lives to write in secret and distribute their work via mimeograph machines. It was that way in Eastern Europe. It was that way in 17th century France. It's always been that way, and it always will. It has an existence that's separate from adversity, separate from politics, separate from economics.
Yeah.
So, in a way, we can sort of separate out writing from the economics of publishing. I think they often become entangled, but they're really different things that are accidentally um, part of the same discussion, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps. No, that may simply take us back.
No, I just don't want to respond. I want to let Karen weigh in. I'm actually blown away at how beautiful that response was.
I mean, I think it is just hard at any time, and that, I think one thing I was just thinking is that I remember when I was selling, I think it was my second book, and it was having trouble, and there was all of this, like, oh my God, there's this new thing that's happening called the ebook, and everything's going to collapse. I think it was 2008 or something. And it was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? My second book had a lot of trouble selling. And so, and then you just go on, and it's like, well, what about social media? And what, it's like on and on, like all these different, like we have the technological advances in our generation are just kind of insane. I mean, I just think about, we talk to students, oh, I went to college with a manual typewriter, which I did, and then now they're like, AI, so within is it one generation, two? I mean, how many? It's just insane. So I think, that you have all these things that are going to be changing. You also have an economic model that has changed since we graduated. I mean, I was just saying, we were just talking recently about a friend we had met when he first moved to New York, who was like a kind of experimental writer poet, and he lived in the East Village in a rent stabilized apartment, and he taught adjunct. Do you remember this?
Okay.
Yeah. And he had a great life, he went to
was living the
readings.
life.
And we're like, wow, look at that, and New York was different, a lot of cities were different, housing was different, and so the economics have just become really cruel to artists.
It was like that, that Simon and Garfunkel song, $30 pays your rent on Bleecker Street.
Right. So it's one of those things where I think that process, of just seeing the world change economically, all these ways, since we started really, in a serious way in like the early 90s. I mean, that it's kind of overwhelming to think about that. But then you think about what does writing do? What does writing do at its purest level? It connects with people in their souls, in their consciousness, in a way that no other art does. And that is actually very low tech, and something that happens when you publish something, even in a magazine. Someone can read it and write to you and say, oh, I love that, or it really moved me, or you can post it on social media and get so I think there are all these ways to connect with readers that are incredibly nourishing and enriching, that are separate from the economy.
So I appreciate that both of you drew a very sharp distinction, which needs to be drawn between the act of writing, what writing is, what writing has always been and probably always will be. It occurs to me that, and we certainly can't solve this problem during this conversation, but what we're talking about as it relates to kind of the economic and professional pressures is really a late stage capitalism problem.
Right.
Rather than, so it's not an artistic problem per se, an academic problem per se, but it's really larger forces. And by way of example, I've definitely mentioned this many times, but I can say truthfully that when I was an undergrad, I had more than one kind of professor mentor say to me when they found out I was contemplating a life in academia, they were so excited and said, this is the best time to be getting into this field because so many of the baby boomers are retiring and there's going to be a whole new crop. You're going to have pick of the litter. We know how that played out, but by the time I was a grad student, the tide had shifted. So it wasn't once I was gone and I look back and say, this is what they told me. These same professors 2, 3 years later were going, yeah, it's I don't know if I can really give you, I don't know if I can truthfully tell you you should pursue a career in this. And what happened, right, was the very beginning of the fault lines of the adjunct model were becoming, all these people did retire, but they weren't being replaced. They were being plugged in.
Right.
Right.
Right. And their wages never raised. I mean, no, people have the same adjunct raises now as they do, 30 years ago in some places.
Right. And the reason I mention this, aside from wanting to get your all's perspective, is I do think that this helps illuminate when people say things that they're not informed. We can't assume that someone that bashes education is going to take the time to be informed, but they need to hear the reality as succinctly as possible, which is, yes, universities are making more money than ever. Yes, tuition is more than it ever was. Yes, in some cases, classroom sizes are exploding, and professors are making the same that they made 30 years ago. Is the problem here that teachers don't care enough, or the teachers aren't good enough, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, because they become profit centers, because it's all about profit, not learning. Yeah.
Yep.
And staff, so it's, oh,
So where do we find, so how do we lean into the fact that the world is changing and academia is changing? You both continue to teach younger writers. You're still, articulating why you find that meaningful work, not just the in principle and philosophy. This is meaningful work. What I'm getting, and I would love you two to elaborate, is that you're both articulating, both in your writing and your teaching, it's the act itself that cannot be polluted by outside forces. It's those two things are kind of the North Star, and we adapt as well as we can to the environment that we're placed in.
Yes.
yeah.
Agreed.
How does one do it?
I don't know. We can end here. So, I don't have, I sometimes wish that I could hover above at 30,000 feet and see the entire landscape whole. But unfortunately, my feet are planted on the ground. What I have a sense that, water, if you think about writing, creativity, and the act of teaching and learning as a fluid, right? It finds a channel through which to move. If that's no longer the university, it will find another channel. So during the pandemic, our universities went remote. We moved back to New York for a variety of reasons, but one was that my mother needed help. I learned how to teach online quite successfully, actually. It's probably not for every student. For the younger students, it's less good, but for adult students, it turned out to be quite good. And it allowed people who didn't otherwise have access to suddenly have access.
Yep.
You could live someplace remote, or you could, not have a lot of money and not be able to afford the cost of commuting to a classroom.
Yeah.
And suddenly it was possible to study writing. And when the pandemic officially ended and we were called back into the classroom, in-person teaching, we both thought, I don't want to go. We wanted to stay where we were. This was where we started out, New York, and it had this beautiful sort of full circle feeling to it. And we could see how there was a living to be made and students to connect with. We've been teaching through a number of online platforms. some of which are continuing ed programs for established universities, but we've
Right.
also been teaching privately. Um,
Mm.
And this is a throwback. If the MFA program is largely a post-war phenomenon in the United States, though it predates into the 30s, but
Right.
if it really took off after World War II, before that, there was a long history of one-on-one mentorship in the writing world. Joseph Conrad learned how to be a novelist from Ford Madox Ford.
Right. Right.
And in a sense, it's possible to replicate that. You know, the
Yeah.
water is just flowing through a different channel.
True.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about, and I have talked a lot about going back to like my days in the corporate world, looking really closely at technology and to what we were, Karen, what you were saying about, we have literally lived through this revolution in technology where in our lifetimes, even in our adult lifetimes, we've gone from a very analog to email to digital to online to everything. But with technology, I love what you're saying, Robert, because again, you're kind of succinctly delineating how the times are what they are, but with the water finding its level, there's a lot of opportunity for inclusivity, affordability, a more robust infrastructure in terms of outreach. It's just that the old models had a certain security maybe that was baked in. And again, that's why I guess I catch myself and say, well, it's really a capitalism thing. It's not an academic thing per se. So to me, that's a tremendous bright spot that there is an opportunity because I think the demand is still there. I think that would maybe be the issue if we were seeing that no one really wants to write anymore, or there's not really students that want to do this, or no one reads anymore. But I don't think that's the case.
Either of those things are true.
Yeah.
What I see myself is more, and there's both a positive and negative side to this, but where we live in Brooklyn, right? You walk a few blocks, you're on Coney Island Avenue. Um, for me, it feels like one of the grand boulevards of the world. For other people, it's a place to get an oil change. Um, but so near us, right, there's this car parts store, and very unusual for New York City, it has a large parking lot. So in that parking lot, there are freelance mechanics who will fix your car. They bring their toolbox. They usually have a van parked in there full of tools, and they will just jack up your car and fix it. And if they need a part, they go into the parts store, right? And so it's this underground cash economy, and that's another subject for another day. But meeting a need in this very sort of intuitive way. And I thought when we had just started our freelance teaching, when I sort of and had just moved to the neighborhood, when I walked by the parking lot and I saw them and I was like, I'm inspired because that's what we're doing too.
Yes. And that gets to my favorite topic, right? Which is very broad, but this notion of the necessity to be part of and to promote communities and micro communities. And I think nowhere more than the artistic world, where maybe traditionally there has been that institutional support where people could be more independent and aloof. I think it's never been more important for the mutual systems of support. They include the hustle, that include the ingenuity. I like what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Totally.
We were talking about before we started recording about just being a teenager and going to rock concerts and seeing bands that sold their own merch, right? They would have a friend with a table selling their merch. They had pressed their own 45s.
Right.
I always liked that.
Well, yeah, just thinking about technology, right? I feel like 30 years ago, even if there was a desire to imitate that in the literary sphere, the reality is you weren't really solving a problem, because then you would have just been printing out a 300-page book and selling it. But now with digital, there are different ways to get the product into consumers' hands, and very much more affordable, much more economically sound. So it's a tremendous bright spot. I just think those of us of a certain age are, well, we were all living through it, but I don't know if we can anticipate the way it's going to shake out. But when the way you two are both talking right now, I see tremendous reason for kind of a very genuine optimism that we just don't know where it's going, but the desire's there, the talent's still there. It's just a matter of figuring out some of the more systematic concerns.
I mean, I think you can absolutely create these communities in these Zoom classes that are really powerful. And there's some I taught for the Iowa Summer Writing Festival where the students were, I had one I had one class where the one guy was zooming from the Ivory Coast. A woman was zooming from Paris, and they were talking in French to each other on the Zoom. It was just like amazing, and you have people getting up at 2 a.m. from India to join a group, or all over the world. So I think it opens, Zoom's amazing.
Yes, India. I've
Yeah,
had a number of
yeah,
students
yeah.
zooming in from India, Thailand.
Mhm,
It's enormously exciting when that happens.
mhm.
And I think this is an important distinction too. As always, I just want to celebrate. You guys always bring up the best nuggets of these little mini epiphanies, because I think, obviously I do exist in some different roles, but when technology comes up, it invariably it gets reduced to like these horrible devices, but the ways in which technology has dehumanized and has taken away jobs, and a lot of those critiques are very valid and need to be explored. But what I think you both just really nailed, and I don't think I've certainly been able to see it so clearly, is a very understandable way that, yes, first of all, everything's complicated. There's not probably going to be white and black. There's a lot of gray area. But what we're talking about via Zoom is a way in which technology has really democratized a lot of these different mechanisms, everything from the creation of books, the production and dissemination, but the way communities are forged. I mean, what a heartening example of people from different countries zooming in and learning from each other. And in some ways, maybe that's kind of the new model for a classroom setting where adults are there with kind of creative skin in the game. It isn't a hobby. These are people that are really there and putting their money in to secure a spot. I find that incredibly reassuring.
And I like the fact
Yeah.
that it comes out of personal need
Mhm.
as opposed to how could you say, societal norms.
Mhm.
18 to 22, I have to be in college. This
Right.
looks like an easy class to take. Not a fun experience often.
Yeah. Yeah, the students that come, they're retired or they want to do it after work are amazing. They're just amazing and have incredible stories, and are very dedicated. So
They're drawing from
that,
rich life experience.
yeah, it's really a fun group to teach. Yeah.
But it's also, I think there's something genuine and important about tying learning to need.
Mhm.
And one of the problems with our view of college in particular, undergraduate learning, is that it's often not tied to need. If students could
Yeah.
actually, I don't know what they would be studying then, perhaps beach. You could have a course on beach. I don't know. It seems to me that most undergraduates probably should be going to school later in
Yeah,
life.
that's true.
Not everyone,
Yeah.
but many. And they would get more out of it.
Mhm.
But that sort of fundamental tie between the need to learn and the learning takes us back to the origin point, the reason.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That just reminds me of, I'm sure it still gets discussed, but I remember when I was a young grad student, I went right from undergrad into grad school, and it was talked about, but I mean, I was able to witness it with my own eyes. The the students that had been out in the, what we used to call, or maybe still call, the real world, but people that had gone on and worked and came back to school, either part-time or full-time, were all in for the most part.
Oh,
So that
yeah.
phenomenon, right, is not new, but I think it's being crystallized on a more diverse socio-political, economic playing field now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there should be a way to replicate what people, and this is not the undergraduate conversation, but the
Right.
graduate conversation. There should be a way to replicate what people get in an MFA outside that structure at
Mm.
less cost, and in a way that better fits the needs of people who are working and have families and yet
Right.
have this tremendous need to write.
Though
Don't
I,
ask me what it is, though.
though I do say MFAs also can be great for community, like,
Of
like,
course.
yeah, I mean, I'm teaching right now for two different MFAs, the Stony Brook one and Alma College and low residency, and you just see this. I was, and I was in person with the students, in an in-person class, and they're so happy to be there, and there's this kind of joy of talking about things in person that also is great. So
Yes.
I think there, yeah, you can't.
I didn't mean
Yeah,
to knock
yeah.
the MFA
Yeah,
as an option,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying a multiplicity of people need a multiplicity of answers.
yes, totally.
No, and in fact, when I teed this part of the conversation up, I was alluding to the fact, I mean, literally just yesterday in Poets and Writers magazine, not a hotbed of negative takes on the industry. One of the headlines was MFA's closing. So that's just the reality, is that there are market forces, there's cultural forces that are playing out. What I find, again, incredibly encouraging about what you both are saying is we're actually getting kind of in the mud here and talking about, is the answer to this to throw our hands up and go, yeah, the academia is a dead end and MFAs are no longer worth it. It's like, of course not. But what I find just both illuminating and very encouraging is this notion, like Robert said, that there's still need out there, and we meet, maybe it's actually kind of a capitalism as it should work, like meeting the demand where it exists in a way where there's a mutual exchange of goods and services that benefit everyone. That's not solving the problem, but it definitely puts a put it it complicates what has become a talking point, right? School's too expensive, no one cares, teachers suck, students aren't engaged. Like, those are all problems that need to be unpacked, but we're getting some real meat on the bone here about what really matters, I think.
Right. And to have people that want to just create the work, it's like such in that sense, there's a purity to it, and then you get the questions that I find annoying, which is like, yeah, like, what kind of platform do you have to have? Which I have no answer for. I actually don't have an answer for that, or it's just like, write a good book. That is my,
So
actually.
I think it's important to say full stop, yes. Having said that, you yourself, right, looking at the trajectory of your, young career, your career in progress, the pressures and expectations on how you promote and bring this forthcoming book into the world are probably quite different than
Right.
what they were 20 years ago.
Right. I mean, like pre-social media, right? I mean, my first book was published in 2000, right? So, uh, and you were 1998, I think, or
It
7.
does seem like another world.
It was another world.
Did the internet exist back then? It did.
It was young.
It was dial-up.
Right.
I remember we treasured that sound, that dial-up sound. It was like, the bell for dinner.
Little did we know, more of that would not be a good thing, but
Right, exactly. It was
Right.
like, okay, the buffet must end now.
But we didn't have our social media lives, which is, and a part of me really likes that. We differ in this. You don't like it as much. Yeah. But
I just can't handle it.
Yeah.
I can't. I don't, I'm sure it's my fault, not Twitter's fault, but I can't.
Well, I'll say, and I want to get back to the whole branding promotion thing, the inevitable part of that. What I've found is that I personally, speaking only for myself, I can give truth to, you have to want to write more than anything else. It's work and you have to do the work. There's no hack for that. All right. There's no shortcut. I write as much as I ever did. I read more than I ever have, but I read less books. And it's a personal problem. I mean, I blame the lives we lead now and social media and digital everything. I read more articles, I read more book reviews, I'm more informed, but I do look back fondly on an era where I had to go check email in the next room so I could put a book in my lap and get lost in it. I do miss, again, I'm owning it. I could change that. I could turn the computer off, but that's one area. But I guess my point, I don't have a point, but there's no excuse to not get the writing done. A. But B, I think we all have had to make these adjustments and what's important and how do we handle the things competing for our time.
It's true. And I think it's an ongoing adjustment that will change at various points in your life. So when we moved back to New York, I started reading on an electronic device because we had no more room for books. And so it was a necessity. And I really, really hated it. It was just something about the loss of print on the page. But I got used to it. And so now I can read quite effectively. There's still problems. I tend to get lost a lot. I can't physically place myself, you know, but then I didn't want to read, printed books because they weren't bright enough. It's like, where's the light? And then somehow I'm returning to books. We have a little more room. We got our own place. Originally, we were living with my mother, which was like living in a junk shop. You couldn't put another book in there. So now we have our own place. I have a library card also, which sort of mitigates that problem. So you can bring a physical book home and then send it out into the wild again.
Yeah.
It's refreshing.
But I always have something good to read on my phone. Like right now I have Henry James, The Princess Casamassima, enormous novel, very interesting, relevant to the present moment because it's his, Joseph Conrad wrote The Secret Agent about, politics on the margins, basically. And this is James's version of that. And so when I'm on the train, it can be hard to even move your elbows to lift a physical book, but I can always lift my phone, right? It's right there. And I can read James on the subway and look up and think, yes, I can be in these two worlds. And there are ways to inhabit the modern age and still hold on to books.
Karen, before you go, that is the quintessential Robert Anthony Siegel anecdote, reading Henry James on a crowded subway and rhapsodizing about it.
You have
one of the many reasons I adore you. Just that description of reality.
It is beautiful.
Karen, what would you add to that observation or your own observation?
I mean, I don't know what I'd add to that. I think that sums a lot of it up, that you want to have a work that you love in your hand and you're engaged with it.
But you don't really read ebooks, right? You read printed
I
books.
do a little ebook reading. I prefer print. I do like, I find harder, but I also use the Brooklyn Public Library online. It's fantastic, so I think it can be, it's great to take books out of the library too.
Sure.
But I do love printed books. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So old soul, in that regard. I am with you there. I have the iPad, but I still prefer tactile for a book. But I'm not going to let you off the hook. I had asked about the excitement dash obligation. How, it's now, well, I'll tee it up this way, and you can, I actually, I would love it if you push back and correct me if I'm wrong. I just think it's safe to say, without any prejudice, just as an observation, what the writer was expected to do, say 25, 20, 15 years ago, when a book came into the world, there's just more expected of a writer. And so better, worse, maybe a bit of both, but a writer can't just say, my book is coming out and all that stuff's being handled. And I'm curious how you've had to lean into, and how much of that is changing your perspective on a new book coming out in these, under these conditions.
Well, I mean, I think, this is now my 5th book of fiction, crazily. So I mean, each one is like it's like a miracle, like it happened, so that's great. I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm going to, if I can get readings anywhere, I would be excited to do them. And then if I can think of any ideas for essays, which I'm supposed to be doing right now, actually, I will write them. But I also think there's a little bit of a feeling that things are out of your control. I think the idea that things necessarily can't really be controlled. And I think that is scary, but I think it's also true. And I think I will post things, as they happen on social media and stuff, and
Sure.
Supporting other writers too, that's helpful, so I think it's all, I don't know, I guess I just do feel like there's a lot you just can't control, and I think that is, I think as a first book writer, I just felt like I wanted to control it, it's like, even though it was also out of control, and the, but I think you just realize that things are kind of out there, and there's not a lot, in certain ways, I don't know what you can do, which sounds
Right.
terrible. Actually, it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but
No. I actually think it's refreshing that you say that, but I wonder, a lot of, I've heard a lot of people either led to believe or commenting on the fact that the pressure now to have your best launch possible, I guess my point is, the onus of that now seems to be entirely on the author. So whatever you can't control or whatever happens, but
right.
if the book doesn't do as well as it should have, could you have done more? I just feel like that's eased into our world now, and it's a very unwelcome, maybe it's necessary and inevitable, but I find that to be an unwelcome added pressure for any creative, that like now, well, and maybe that's a late capitalist thing too, frankly. Like, if your book didn't do as well as you thought it could do, well, did you put yourself out there enough? And it's like, God, it's a very exhausting way to have to try to navigate
Yeah.
putting your best work out, but also standing out amongst all this competition.
Right. I don't know. I honestly, Sean, this sounds terrible, but I'm sort of trying not to think about it that much.
Well, and that may exist under the larger heading of the million billion ways to torture yourself.
Yeah, right.
Oh, if I had only been a better person, or if I had studied harder, or if
Right.
I had just gone to that party and met the right person,
Right,
I would
right.
now be emperor of the world.
Right.
So where I'm coming from, so I'm saying I find Karen's answer, I mean, wonderful, because what I'm saying is I'd like to think we could reclaim a bit of the joy is the writing. Again, some of this stuff starts to sound pretty trite, but if you've put the best book you can together, there's nothing can approximate that feeling of satisfaction and achievement. But also, if we're measuring the experience of bringing a book into the world by its Amazon ranking or how many reviews it got or, its social media engagement. I guess I'm just saying I see more angst amongst our literary brethren and sistren. So I'm not proposing an answer. I'm not above it. But
Yeah.
I guess I'm saying it's good that you're not. I didn't expect you to answer differently, but I'm glad that you're not feeling consumed by, well, now I'm kicking off my pre-launch, like every day I've got 18 things to do. I mean, I hear a lot of people that get really wrapped up in, and I think it's an undue amount of pressure.
That's easy to. I mean, I will also say this is my fourth book with Counterpoint, and I really do trust them and their publicity department. They're amazing. And
Right.
I know they're going to be doing whatever they can. And I know they're, hopefully things will happen. I mean, I know they're trying, they're trying. So that's good. I feel like, what can I do? I can think about, what can I write, or but if I can think of bookstores or whatever, but I feel like it's a weird mind game played on writers, I mean, maybe that would be an interesting essay. What are the mind games you get on a writer, as in this culture right now, and what is success? And it's all very arbitrary and nebulous, and there's a lot of luck and timing, like a lot, and so that, and I think that sort of part of it is hard to grapple with.
I think if it's not abundantly clear just from this conversation why I respect both of you and like you both so much, for me, having had many, many, many discussions on and off the record, it ultimately always seems to come back to two things, and they're not really shocking. Uh, the writers I know that tend to be happiest are the writers that do the work and find enjoyment in that process of creating problems that only they can solve, for better or worse,
Yeah.
and having reasonable expectations and trying to live happy lives, period. I think the people that think writing is going to save them or give them a living, or if
No.
they do better than the competition, it's not a zero-sum game. So the writers that are part of something a little bit bigger than themselves, as dorky as that sounds, it just seems it's unassailable that that tends to be the writers and creatives that have carved out a way to live a life that's both meaningful and enriching.
Yeah. And I think I mean, what I tell my students is, your book, this is how I think about writing too, is what do I want to say? What do I want to say that hasn't been said? And I look at the stories that I've written in here, and they're all in different ways, things I want to say to someone, to the world, about some issue of parenting or growing up or something, or also some political things that I feel like need to be said in this particular way. And it feels like a great privilege to be able to do it, and to actually have it published is it's amazing, so there's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think something about, when you have little children,
Mhm.
there's this very disconcerting feeling of sort of the camera swiveling. Like, I didn't realize my camera was always pointed at myself. Now I have to always point it at this little being. And at first, I hated that. Why isn't the camera properly placed on myself? And then I was watching our son, he was about 1, and we were both on the floor. He couldn't walk yet, and I fell asleep. I was so tired, we got no sleep. The kid never slept. And when I woke up, he had pulled the phone cord out of the wall. He had ripped the cable was all out of the wall. It was, real damage. And I had been asleep 10 minutes. So I was like, oh, you better be behind that camera and it better be pointed at him, right? And what I think, and ultimately over time, as I adjusted, it became such a relief that the camera wasn't pointed
Yeah,
at me,
right.
that the camera was pointed outward into the world
Mhm.
and the people I loved. And That's, I think, what writing also affords people, the possibility of pointing the camera outward to the story, to the characters in the story, imaginative beings. And as Karen said, the thing I want to say, if that becomes more important than who is saying it, I think the story will work. It will find its way.
Mhm.
I know when my stories start to lag in process, I realize, oh, I'm thinking about myself now. I'm not thinking about the story.
Interesting.
But when I forget that I'm the storyteller. We talk in the writing world a lot about the storyteller, of course, but in a way, the storyteller needs to disappear for the story to be born.
Yeah. That's great.
That's kind of like a very Brooklyn Zen,
Well, I
the
also think
inimitable.
that it's great. And I also think the idea of the camera focusing out a little bit is also about teaching. And teaching
Yes.
is really rewarding. I mean, yeah, it doesn't pay great, but it is really nourishing. And when we were just talking about like some student that had some amazing story and how fun it is to help them get it better. And, then when they start placing things, I had this one student recently who placed a story essay in Image Magazine, and she was, she posted it, and all these people loved it. It was just fantastic, so
Yeah.
there is that feeling too, once you feel like, I mean, you feel like you've said things and you've gotten, some acclaim, and it's a good feeling, and then you see other students, it's great. So I think there is also that nice thing about being this age, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I thank both of you for we talk about show don't tell. You throughout this entire conversation, I think you've made it abundantly clear why I always love talking to you. But you're demonstrating some of the stuff that seems to come up over and over again in these various discussions, which is it starts here, right, and here, but looking outward, finding real meaning in the journey, the craft, and then uplifting others so that one doesn't become kind of morbidly obsessed with one's own achievement or whatever status. These are all the deep secrets that I think the good news is that we're able to share them and hear them from experts like yourselves, but also remind people that these are very attainable. This doesn't require tremendous amounts of discipline or study. These are really fundamental human truths.
Right. And also that, we're I don't know when you'll post this, but we're, 2 weeks before this really important election, and the country's in a really hard place, and it's important for artists to stick together. I think we're a vulnerable group, and I also think that we're a group that can do great good, and also there's a lot of need to express oneself, and it feels good to express things, and so I think that's important too.
Here, here.
I agree.
I don't know, what are you thinking?
Well, I'll tease the audience by saying I hope you enjoyed this. If you could have heard what we talked about before we came live, it's kind of like Fight Club. Can't talk about it, but we got some good stuff here. But I will say, I think it's again very, very clear why it's just always such a great joy to talk to you. And the gift of being these literary citizens that really walk the walk is invaluable. But I have to tell you both, I always come away feeling kind of renewed and refreshed, inspired. And there is something special about being part of a community that you feel the best of that community does make you want to be a better person. So that's the biggest thank you I can offer both of you.
Sean, we feel the same
know.
way about you.
Yes.
In fact,
It's
because you're on the other side, we're on our best behavior.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, she is really good.
Well, it's obviously a mutual admiration society, but it's a very humbling one on my part. I'm delighted. Karen, we did what we had to do, but we've got more to talk about. So we will return to this forthcoming collection once we get into 2025. So for now, Enjoy the ride. Thank you both for sharing your time and your insights. This is great stuff. And I beseech you to return, and we'll check in the new year and see where we're at as a society and as artists.
Would love to.
Yes.
Okay, it's a date. Well, folks, thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. A reminder, this is the podcast where we're obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity in all its myriad forms. If you know someone that would want to be on this podcast or you have a recommendation, check it out at seanmurphy.net. In the meantime, do what we've talked about. Support your artistic community, pay it forward, buy books, promote books, be a good citizen of the world, be safe, and we will see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.